Comfort is not a reward. Comfort is the beginning of the end. 500 years ago, a man who had been tortured, stripped of everything, and exiled to rot on a Tuscan farm sat down at a rough wooden table and wrote a letter to the only friend he had left. There wasn't a single complaint in that letter. He didn't ask for handouts, and he didn't beg to be brought back. Instead, he laid out something far more dangerous, a true operating manual for how life actually works. Not the version sold to you by your parents, not the sermon preached from a pulpit, and not the motivational fairy tale claiming that hard work is always rewarded and good people always win. What he wrote was a raw blueprint of human nature and the mechanics of how the world grinds down those who refuse to understand it. His name was Nickel. Machiavelli, and the uncomfortable truth he encoded in his manuscripts has been distorted, softened, and deliberately silenced for 5 centuries because power does not survive when ordinary people begin to understand its mechanics. What Machiavelli discovered wasn't a political theory. It was a diagnosis of life itself. By the end of this text, you will view every relationship you have, every failure, and every betrayal through a lens so precise that it will feel like someone finally turned on the light in a room where you have been stumbling in the dark your entire life. Yet hidden within his legacy is a single principle that most scholars prefer to gloss over. It is a principle that completely changes how you will spend the next decade of your life. And it won't appear at the very beginning, it will arrive only when you are finally ready to hear it. The letter from the dead, December 10, 1513. A 44-year-old man sits in the Tuscan village of Sant'Andrea in Percasina, about 6 miles south of Florence. Just 14 months earlier, he had been the secretary of the Florentine Republico, a diplomat who negotiated with kings, commanded militias, and looked the most dangerous men in Italy in the eye. Then the Medici returned to power. He was accused of conspiracy, arrested, and subjected to the strappado. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was suspended by his wrists from a rope until his shoulders were dislocated. They dropped him from the rope 6 times. He didn't confesso because there was nothing to confess. They released him, stripped him of all his titles, and banished him to rot on his family farm. Most people would have broken right there. Any ordinary person would have surrendered to bitterness, self-pity, and a slow, invisible slide into obscurity. But Machiavelli did something else. In a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, he described his daily routine. Mornings were spent managing a falling-apart estate and bickering over pennies with woodcutters. Afternoons were spent at the tavern, playing cards with the local butcher and miller, screaming and arguing loudly enough to be heard in the neighboring towns. Petty, vulgar, and far beneath his former dignity. But then evening came, and this is where the autobiography turns into a revelation. He wrote, "When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. At the threshold, I take off my muddy, dust-covered workday clothes and put on royal and courtly robes. Appropriately dressed, I step into the ancient courts of ancient men, where, warmly welcomed by them, I feed on the only food that is truly mine and for which I was born." Listen to that again. A man covered in mud, humiliated by fate, thrown onto the scrap heap. But the moment he walked into that room, he refused to be a nobody. He dressed for the occasion. He treated a conversation with dead philosophers as the most important appointment of his day. And in that room, stripped of wealth, status, and power, wrote The Prince, a book that reshaped Western understandings of power, human nature, and reality itself. Why does this matter to you? Because Machiavelli's life is the first lesson of his philosophy. He didn't theorize about hardship from inside a palace. He wrote a survival guide at the exact moment life was actively trying to destroy him. Here is the detail almost everyone misses: he didn't just read books at night. He held a dialogue with the authors. He wrote down objections, jotted questions in the margins, and argued with them. This wasn't passive studying, it was the active work of a mind that refused to surrender. And the first principle he extracted from that work is this: life does not reward kindness. Life rewards accuracy. Not the accuracy of a target, but the accuracy of perception, the ability to see people, systems, and yourself without the comforting distortions you apply to reality just because the raw truth makes you too uncomfortable. Most people die without ever acquiring this gift. They live inside a story. A story that loyalty is always rewarded, that effort is always recognized, and that the universe has a built-in sense of justice. Machiavelli called people like this raw material for other people's ambitions. Not out of hatred, but because he observed with cold, surgical precision how the world actually operates. And it operates on a logic that has nothing to do with fairness. The mechanics of the machine. In his discourses on Livy, Machiavelli made one of his most unsettling observations. He wrote that all men are naturally wicked and that they will only do what is right when they are forced to do so. Most people recoil at those words. It sounds cynical, extreme, and dark. But he wasn't making a moral statement, he was making an engineering statement. Think of it like gravity. Gravity isn't evil. It doesn't hate a person who slips off a cliff. It simply operates. It is a force. If you understand it, you can build bridges, airplanes, and skyscrapers. If you deny it, the earth won't become any softer for you. Human selfishness is the psychological equivalent of gravity. Itis not a defect, itis the engine. When Machiavelli said people are wicked, he meant one simple thing: under enough pressure, every single person will put their own survival, their own comfort, and their own status ahead of yours. Not necessarily because they are evil, but because of how they are built. And those exceptions you cling to: a friend who will never betray you, the partner who loves you unconditionally. Machiavelli would reply with cold precision, you simply haven't applied enough pressure yet to test that hypothesis. There is no bitterness in Thessaloniki liberation. Because the moment you accept this operating principle, you stop being shocked. You stop being wounded by the predictable. You stop blaming people for acting in accordance with their nature, and you start building your life on a foundation that can actually hold weight instead of the shifting sand of other people's promises. The war you were born into. This is where Machiavelli's philosophy breaks away from every motivational speech you have ever heard. He didn't believe you could be anything. He didn't believe in boundless potential. He believed in something far more dangerous and far more useful. He believed that life is a permanent war between two forces, and your fate depends entirely on which one you feed. The first force he called vert. For centuries, this word has been mistranslated as virtue. It has nothing to do with moral goodness. Vert is effective power, an alloy of skill, cunning, determination, energy, courage, and strategic intelligence that allows a person to bend circumstances to their will. It is the muscle that pushes back against chaos. The second force he called fortuna. Fate, or luck in the modern sense. Fortuna is a blind, indifferent, destructive current of events that no human being can fully control: illness, economic collapse, the random lottery of birth, a betrayal you didn't see coming, or an opportunity arriving 10 years too late. Machiavelli compared fortuna to a swollen, raging river, brutal and unpredictable, capable of washing away everything in its path. And here is the part that should keep you awake tonight: he argued that fortuna governs roughly half of all human affairs. Half. That means half of your life, its ultimate outcome, results, and final destination is entirely outside your control. No amount of discipline, planning, or genius can change that. But the other half belongs to vert, and that half decides everything. Most people waste their vert, their actual capacity to act on things that don't matter, arguing with strangers online, maintaining relationships that died years ago, chasing careers chosen just for someone else's approval, and building habits that fill time but build nothing. And then, when fortuna strikes, when the flood comes, they have nothing left. No levees, no reserves, no structure. They stand out in the open and beg the river to be kind. The river is never kind. The Art of Necessity. In Machiavelli's writings, one word appears with almost religious frequency: necessit, one necessity. He argued that necessity is the great sculptor of human character. When a person is comfortable, they reveal nothing about themselves because nothing is required of them. But put that same person under real pressure, strip away their safety nets, and force them to act or perish, and for the first time, you will see who they truly are. This is why Machiavelli noted that the greatest leaders, the sharpest minds, and the most dangerous strategists were almost all forged in deprivation, never in privilege. Talent didn't set them apart. Necessity burned away every option except one: absolute excellence. He wrote in the Discourses, sometimes the greatest wisdom is to pretend to be a fool. Not because stupidity is a good strategy, but because when the world underestimates you, when you are written off, and when the pressure of expectations is lifted, you are given something priceless: time. Time to build without interference. Time to observe while remaining unnoticed. Time to prepare for the moment you step off the sidelines and into the center of the board. Machiavelli lived this himself for 14 years after his exile. He wrote, studied, attended meetings of Florentine intellectuals in the Oristolari gardens, composed comedies, wrote poetry, and honed the observations that would become the most influential body of political thought in Western history. Scholars studying his surviving manuscripts noticed something fascinating: the drafts of the prince are covered in corrections. He rewrote the exact same passages 10 to 15 times. Not out of perfectionism, but because he had time and no illusion that he would ever be read during his lifetime. None of it brought him recognition while he was alive. He died in 1527, poor and largely forgotten. The Prince was published 5 years after his death, the Discourses even later. He sowed seeds in a field he would never harvest. And that is perhaps the deepest lesson of all, because most people refuse to work if the reward isn't visible, if the applause can't be heard, and if the payoff isn't instant. Machiavelli would call that a Cervantes mentality, mindset of someone who only performs when someone is watching. The person of vert acts because the work itself is the architecture of their character. Not because it guarantees a reward, but because without it, you are simply an animal reacting to stimuli. Ask yourself honestly, how many vital things are you putting off right now just because you don't see an immediate payoff or hear the crowd cheering? Not because people are evil, but because selfishness is the gravity of human psychology, and gravity never takes a day off. You are given a body that ages, a mind that lies to itself, a window of time that is shorter than you think, and half of everything that happens to you will be determined by forces you cannot see, predict, or control. The Machiavellian response to all of this is not despair. The response is accuracy. Build your vert, not the fake discipline of morning alarms and protein shakes, but the real thing. The ability to see the world as it actually is and move through it without flinching. The capacity to lose everything and retain the internal architecture to rebuild from scratch. The skill of reading people not by how you want them to be, but by what their actions prove they are. Prepare for fortuna. Build your levees before the flood. Develop skills that cannot be taken away from you. Cultivate relationships tested by time, not just convenience. Save when there is no crisis, so that when the crisis hits, you don't have to beg. Accept the cycle. Your comfort is temporary. Your strength will be tested. And the exact moment you believe you have finally made it is the precise moment the ground starts giving way beneath your feet. And above all, act. Because Machiavelli's deepest contempt wasn't reserved for villains, it was aimed at the passive. At the person who watches the world burn through a window and says, "What can I do?" owed someone given hands, legs, a mind, and time, who wastes all four waiting for permission. Machiavelli insisted, God wants people to act, not sit on their hands waiting for a miracle. Whether you believe in God or not, that principle is lethal in its clarity. The universe punishes inaction far more severely than it punishes the wrong action. At least the person who moved incorrectly generated data. The person who stayed frozen in place created nothing. In that farmhouse in Sant'Andrea covered in mud, burdened by debt, still carrying the memory of dislocated shoulder, so man sat down every single evening, put on the only dignity he had left, and built something that would outlast everyone who tried to destroy him. He didn't wait for the world to invite him back. He created something the world could no longer afford to ignore. That is the lesson. No strategy, no manipulation, no cold-blooded power games. The real lesson is this: life will take from you everything it can. Your only move is to become the kind of person who can rebuild from whatever is left. 500 years later, his words still cut. His enemies are dust, yet here you are, reading a letter written by a dead man in exile, feeling something stir inside your chest. That is the awakening movement of Vert. Don't let it fall back asleep. And one final question for you and me: if Machiavelli were looking at your life right now, what would he point to first? The answer to that question is most likely where you need to start. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments. I tried not just to retell Machiavelli, but to dissect his work so it can be applied to real life right now. If something caught your attention or still feels unclear, drop a comment, and let's break it down. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive.